Hi, everybody. This is Lauren Baker, founder of Search Engine Journal. Welcome to today's SEJ show. With me today, I have Cody Gault of Conductor. How's it going, Cody?
It's going well. How are you today?
Pretty good, thanks. Pretty good. So today we're going to talk about technical SEO and site migrations. This is actually a follow-up because we had Cody on a webinar a while back, and we got so many questions coming in about site migrations. Like, I don't know about you, Cody, but it feels like to me there's so many companies right now that are either they're replatforming, they're changing their design, they're changing their brand, maybe they're integrating they're trying to integrate in the WordPress for their blog or this and that. And there just seems to be a lot of like major migrations going on right now. And then also micro migrations at the end of the day. You seeing anything similar out there?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of it since all I do really these days is technical SEO and migrations all the time. We talk to a lot of people, and that's been pretty common actually lately. It's, URLs aren't changing a whole lot, but like I said, everybody's moving to a different platform. They're trying something else out. Some phased migrations, like I said, micro and scope, maybe part of the site. Seeing a lot of it.
Cool. So before we get started talking about migrations and technical SEO, how about if you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Cody Gault. I am the migration services lead over here at Conductor. I've been doing SEO for something like, if I wrap up all my time together, about 10 years or so, maybe a little bit over that. But the last like three years, I think, maybe a little over 3 years, it's been almost purely migration related technical SEO. At this point, I don't even know if I can do keyword research. I can because I just did it, but it's rough. And then, I work for Conductor. We're an enterprise SEO platform. Lots of bells and whistles there. So the nice thing of that, we get to see a lot of different clients, a lot of big sites, but we get to work on some small sites also.
Great. And it seems like you've really carved a niche in the industry or from a service perspective with working on migrations. How did you get into working on so many of them? And how did you cut your chops when it comes to site migrations?
Yeah, so I used to work at an agency. I've got an agency background. I've also worked in-house. And when I was at an agency is when I really started to work on migrations. In-house, we had some maybe like micro migrations going on,
right?
But the agency side is where it picked up, and like the first big migration I did was an international migration. It was actually, it was years ago. It was actually for Puma at the time. This was like 4 years ago, something like that. So a nice way to be thrown in, right? You get a big international client, and you're like, all right.
Nothing's at stake here.
Yeah, nothing's at stake. It'll be fine. So did that. And then at the time I was on a whim, my wife and I were like, hey, it'd be fun kind of live in New York, and because we had some friends living there and Conductor was based out there. So I contacted them, and I had mentioned that I was doing, migrations and everything. And so they're like, well, hey, like we have migrations that come through. How about we set up like a migration services thing and you can just run with that? I was like, sure. Because I'll tell you, I prefer technical SEO and all that to about any other aspect of SEO. So to me, it was like, well, it's one of the hardest things in SEO, or at least the most stressful to deal with. And so I was like, yeah, that'll be perfectly fine. I'll just do that for 3 years now.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny because like I first got into migrations by not actually doing them, but cleaning up past migrations.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how it is. You get a lead. Someone's like, hey, our traffic dropped. Why'd your traffic drop? Well, we decided to do this last year. Oh, okay, I see. Oh, you got a bunch of 404s. You got a bunch of links pointing to 404s. You guys didn't redirect last year when you did this? Oh, no. Well, who managed this? Oh, this agency, or this guy that used to work here. This person used to work here. They're gone now. Oh, who took care of it? Oh, this agency, but we haven't worked with them. So just like it's sometimes it can be like a nice archaeological dig, right? Because when I start going through sites that have gone through migrations and start to have that problem, you end up finding a lot more sometimes than just that one migration. Sometimes, like I've worked on projects where there's a .html version of the site, there's a .asp version of the site. Like just going through those 404 reports in Search Console can be amazing because you can see like everything is being hit, and then like going through like broken link reports like an Ahrefs. By the way, today's episode is sponsored by Ahrefs and Adzuma, which make today's episode possible. So please check them out when you have a chance. But just like going through those broken link reports and stuff like that, you can identify so much. And then you bring it up and they're like, oh yeah, we did used to be on Shopify 3 years ago. We decided to change that, or we did do this. And it's amazing, like post-migration, the ability to connect those dots and fix it can have so much benefit, right? But the big thing is someone's going through a site migration. What are some ways that they can pre-plan to make sure that if you're switching from one domain to the next, right? Or from like one platform, like maybe you're switching from WooCommerce over to Shopify Plus. So what are some ways to pre-plan and eliminate risk when you're going through a site migration?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, this is where we start everything off. It's the first thing that I really learned when I started migrations. On our side, we call it a stack rank document. Really what it is a URL inventory. A lot of people give it different names. I've heard core URL list, things like that. So we start from the top. We're like, well, here's the domain. So what's everything in existence that's tied to this domain? So, right. I'm like, are there any rankings? You've got all sorts of companies out there that are pulling rankings. Grab and export. Like, what pages actually have rankings? I want to see what's, getting traffic today. Google Analytics, also great. Google Analytics, you kind of have a couple ways you can go with too. I like to grab about a year's worth of data, sometimes a little bit more. But I mean, there's nothing stopping you from going 5 years back. You're probably going to find those ancient URLs if you really want to. I don't typically do that. It's never really come up that I've had to. But sometimes, you go back a little bit longer, just make sure, cover your bases. And then, backlinks. Like I said, that broken links report, really good, low-hanging fruit. You should look at it anytime you're working on a site, right? If you have multiple backlink databases that you have access to, you've got Majestic, you've got Ahrefs, you've got Moz, SEMrush has one too. And there's some others out there. Find out what had backlinks at one point, So we grab all that, we do a crawl of the site, and we just compile it. Because once you do that, like you can look through, here's every URL, right? And then you can look and like, well, this URL is like ranking for like 500 keywords. It's got like 300 backlinks, 20 root domains, stuff like that. Well, now I know, I want that. And then from there, you just I go through that whole list. We'll look through, and it's a great way to tell, like, all right, here's where the value is, here's everything that's good. And you also find some of those links, you're talking about like 3 years ago, they're running off of something that's, old, like I said, ASP. You'll find those URLs in there. Then you can make the decision like, well, do I want to redirect them? How long have they been redirected?
Right.
Or maybe it's just a case sometimes like, let's just leave it. I mean, I did a migration recently where we found some URLs that the last crawl date from Google, I think, was like 2017, and just no links, no rankings, no traffic, didn't show up anywhere. I was like, I'm not going to really worry about that one. But yeah. So I really, the summary of it, a URL inventory, every source of truth I can find, grab it, put it in. And then from there, it's a case of making a decision of, do I want to migrate this over? Is there value there? Or is it better to just, 404 this, let it die? Because sometimes it is, sometimes there's just stuff that doesn't matter.
And if you're going to, make sure it's actually 404, right? So like one thing I typically find in migrations is that sometimes people will utilize, a CMS solution for the bulk of their site, but maybe like, if it's a site that had menus on it, they'll upload PDFs via FTP. Sometimes they'll upload them to the non-secure version, not the secure version. So they still kind of linger around. So FTP, images, different types of files, things like that. Things can actually not only be linked to or in the index, but at the end of the day, like you don't want a PDF file from 2015 hanging around that says a car wash costs like, $12 when now it's like $25. Like maybe car wash is not the best example, but you know what I mean? Like you don't want to have like historic incorrect information hanging around because that always leads to an issue with customer service. So that's really cool to hear. And like I said, we had a lot of questions that came through when we did our webinar a while back. So I'm going to go ahead and start kind of going through these. The first one comes from our friend Raymond at Knife Center, who stacked up a lot of questions during the whole migration webinar. Raymond's question is, given a choice between 301 redirects and maintaining an old URL in a new one, and canonicalizing to the old, at least initially, which is better, least risky option? So sounds like the question is, it's a little bit confusing, but it sounds like the question may be, when you're introducing all these new URLs, should you immediately redirect old to new, or should you launch the new canonical to the old, or vice versa, let Google pick up the canonical and then redirect in the future?
Yeah, so I've actually gone through this exact situation. It was a couple of years ago now. So things, of Google, there's changes. But I would say the safest thing to do is just do the 301 redirect, right? Yeah. 301 redirect is gospel, whereas the canonical, Google may honor it, they may not. And in the past, like, this is something that I tried with a client one time because it was a phased migration. So we were like, well, let's see, like, we want to move things over, but we haven't, fully pushed the brand change. So let's try it out. They went through, they tried it, and Google is just like, no, we're good with the old URL. We're not going to show the new one. And, part of that's probably comes down to, at the end of the day, you have all of those internal links pointing to the old URL. You have the sitemaps point to the old URL. All your backlinks are to the old URL. So simply canonicalizing it to the new URL isn't really always going to do something. It's not to say it won't always work. I'm sure there's cases where it will. But in my experience, it just didn't work as well. So I think it's one of those things you can do if you're like, hey, we're getting the new site set up. We will do a brand push, but we want to get things up and running, and we'd like to try it out. Yeah, go for it. But don't necessarily expect that Google's going to honor it. If you really want those new URLs in the index and you really want to move things over, do the 301 redirects. And let's be real, the way Google is, it's probably going to take a little bit before they even update the index to point that old URL to the new one, when you're searching for things. So yeah, in summary, I'd redirect it if you really wanted to move.
So just to reiterate, the canonical is a suggestion. Google's may honor the canonical, they may not. Chances are, if you have any issues with your site from a crawl perspective, right, that they may not honor it. Also, if the two pages have different content, I've noticed, like, even title tag content, that could lead to it not being honored, but all around different content, or even a different template serving the content differently, may not be honored as well. Whereas the 301 is an absolute, right? It's like, boom, bang. Like, this is where it is. There ain't no going back, right? So Google's going to definitely follow that. Just like when you're managing your staff, you give an open-ended suggestion. They're like, well, what did he say? Like, they're like, do this right now. It's due tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Like, okay, I got it. So awesome. Good to hear. I think there was a big trend with utilizing canonicals with migrations in the past, but just seems like there's a lot more issues than need be. Okay, next question. Is it true that 301 redirects can slow down your site by any means, or is it best practice to add redirects to every old page, to the new page? So let's start with is it true that 301 redirects can slow down your site?
Yeah, so I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe 3. There was a guy who did a test. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you his name right now. I can't remember it, but it is in my history from tabs on another computer. So if you look up, like, do 301s slow down my site, HT access test, he should come up on Google, something like that. Anyways, he ran a test, and he did find that, yes, they will slow down the site. But the slowdown starts, like, with when you start getting like tens of thousands, I believe. And even then, it's a very minuscule amount of, slowness. So do they slow down the site? Yes, they can. But typically at that level that you're talking, I don't think most people are dealing with that many redirects. So, it is something to consider. And if you're a site and you're like, got 1 million pages and you want to redirect all of them, I'd probably err on the side of caution of just saying, well, let's just look at actually what's got value. Because Odds are most of those pages don't. So, it's something to take into consideration. But in my experience with the stuff I've been doing, I haven't really seen it be an issue. And there's another thing too, is how are the redirects being done? You've got Nginx, you've got Apache. I'm most familiar with Apache with HT access, and hits the page, checks the list. So, it's something to look into, but in general, I don't worry about it too much. But if you're going to get into tens of thousands, it's good to do some testing and maybe think of another plan.
And this also goes down to the where is Google finding, or where even is a user finding the 301 redirects? Like, you never ever want to have an accessible 301 redirect on your site, right? That's just ever.
Yep.
And a lot of the times it is a developer shortcut. Well, we'll just redirect everything, but they don't change the navigation or anything. So you just have like the old URL linked to the navigation, fires a redirect. If you have the redirect accessible on your site, that's definitely going to slow down your browser. Or sorry, not slow down the browser. It's going to slow down on the server load on that end. However, it is very natural to have external links, which 301 to the new location to your site, right? So to your point, if the page is getting a lot of traffic and it's linked a lot, you can easily go see sorry, just reading one of the comments. You can easily go and look at the most prioritized, most valuable links that are pointing to your site, and go through and contact those publishers and those entities, and then ask them just to update the link. At least that way, Google isn't constantly hitting a 301 from CNET or Washington Post or something like that to your site on an ongoing basis, right? Especially if it's something that's actually referring traffic and users and hitting your server logs all the time.
Yep.
So that's a really good tip on that side. Just try to slow them down. And to your point, just handle. You can also prioritize the 301s, right? So when you're doing a migration, next question that comes in from Evangelos from Greece. Evangelos asks, is it better when you're doing a migration to change the title tags and meta descriptions, or leave them as is? So is it good to have some consistency with Google with doing that migration, or should you just do it all at once, or would you recommend phasing? How does that typically work on your site?
Yeah, I personally like consistency. If you can hold off until the migration, moves over, and you can wait say 2 months, especially, we've got all these wonderful changes of titles and H1 tags going on right now, throwing things for a loop. I say hold off. Meta description, personally, we know it's not a ranking factor. It's better for, your click-through rate. So you could probably change that one all you want. But on the title, I would hold off. Now, where I think the caveat is if you're going through a brand change, right? And, you're changing everything, you got to change it. Okay, just do it. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal there. What I would say, and we've had on occasion happen, is you're like, well, we want to change we want to do some changes now, and the migration's 3 months out. It's like, well, yeah, go ahead, change titles. You got some time, 2 months out, sure. A month out, yeah, you probably see what's happening. I don't know if I'd risk it then. But if you've got a lot of time beforehand, make the changes, because you'll have enough time to see how Google reacts. But in general, it's just another one of those little things that can tilt things ever so slightly and may make a change. And that's for me why I say, hey, hold off as much as you can, because things matter. I think it was just the other day or last week, maybe this week, that John Mueller had said, I don't know when he said it, but layout changes can impact things. Lots of things. Right. When you do a redesign too, can change things. So there's all these little parts, and if you have control of anything, if you can hold off, just hold off. Again, with the caveat that if you got 3 months beforehand, yeah, go for it. It's fine by me.
That's actually a good transition to the next point. So I saw that as well. It's just changing themes, templates, stuff like that can definitely affect your SEO. And if you just do a search on Google for fastest Shopify themes or slowest Shopify themes, there's multiple different sites that just list all the themes, fastest to slowest. And you know what? If you're on a pretty fast theme and you decide to go to the slow one because someone in marketing thought it looked better at the end of the day, then that's definitely going to affect your SEO. Like it
Mhm.
just makes sense, right? So try to go in the opposite direction if possible. And I really like that point about, you know what? You don't have to wait until the migration goes live to update those title tags. Like you can do it beforehand, test it out, and at least that way you're giving Google some consistency,
Mhm.
right? So if your future title tag you can apply a month before or 2 months before or whatever, you don't see your rankings drop, or maybe you see a little bit of an increase, or maybe Google decides to rewrite it to like some inbound H2 from another page on your site, then at least you're kind of prepping, right? You're priming the pump, so to
Mhm.
speak, from a migration standpoint. So going back to your last comment about changing themes and changing templates, what are some great ways to test the usability and performance of a site from a speed and rendering perspective before you go live? Like, are there tools out there that you can utilize to test that staging environment before you flip the
Yeah.
switch?
Yeah. So I would say that's one of the areas that sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we don't. At the end of the day, it depends on how much access to that staging site we have. And there's some caveats, right? It depends. Our favorite answer. So I have in the past used, webpagetest.org. Sometimes I've been able to
Great
get
tool.
oh yeah, love it. Sometimes been able to get page speed insights through also to check to see what they're saying there. And those are the two that I primarily use. I know there's some other tools out there. I think there's there's Speed Curve. I think that's it. There's GT Metrics, I believe. I just stick with page speed insights, Lighthouse Audit Report, and webpagetest.org. So if you can tell your developers, hey, can we open it up so that we can use webpagetest.org? I believe you can go in there. You can set like a custom user agent, or you can set in authentication credentials so you can get in there. That's a good way to test things. See how are things going, how are those changes reacting. The one thing you got to keep in mind, though, and I see this all the time, the staging environment is on a server that is not as good as production. Yeah. And so I've run into issues where things are super slow. And it's not in any way, the same as production. I mean, 5 seconds slower, but it'll move over and everything will be fine. So you do have to keep that in mind that depending on how that server's set up, it may be slower. 2, staging environments often they don't have everything fully loaded, and developers may not be willing to make all the changes that they should. And sometimes stuff goes on live and then you deal with it. But it does give a good baseline to see how things are going. And then, at the end of the day, we still have, in DevTools, we have our network tab. And so we can look through there and see, hey, how are things going speed wise? How long's things taking to load and all of that. So there are options. Generally, I want to say for servers, like in the speed aspect, it's like 50-50. Sometimes there's no difference in the actual between staging and production speed, and the other time it's really slow, but it is enough to give you an idea. Now, I will say sometimes you are just locked out, and your only option seems to be your network tab. In which case, you've got network tab, you can run a coverage report to see like unused bytes and everything, but you got to let them know like, hey, this isn't necessarily fully accurate. Things are going to probably appear worse here than they are, just based on what's going on, but it's enough of a hint. I will say, though, like the best thing you can do when you're looking at it, just check the image sizes. That's usually, every time I see something, it's the biggest culprit, followed by like bloated JavaScript. But guess which one is actually going to probably be fixed? Images. So, check for those things. But yeah, in summary, webpagetest.org, PageSpeed Insights, network tab on your browser, Lighthouse Audit, but talk to your developers, see what they can, open up for you, and then run with it.
Yeah, I've become a huge fan of webpagetest.org. Not only because of all the tests you can do, but because of the videos they have, like the videos of like loading the largest contentful page and everything else. It's amazing because it's great. It really helps with visualizing what the issue is at the end of the day. Like sometimes just sending over like a Lighthouse report is not going to do it, right? Especially to C-suite, where you got to get that influence.
Yeah.
But sending over a video, heck yeah, all day. And to your point, the server that's in the production server may be a little bit slower, right? That's being tested on and stuff like that before it goes live. But another thing is, even if the server is the same, sometimes a lot of the bells and whistles that can slow down a site, such as customer review apps, email apps like Clavio, or Clavio, that's so slow. Like it really, really slows down the loading of the site. Google Apps, Google Ads, Ad Pixels, JavaScript.
Mhm.
A lot of those bells and whistles are added at the last minute, right? So the ability to be able to run that performance test when all of that is added is fantastic, because if you're running it beforehand, you're like, oh yeah, this is great. This site's going to be like an 80 in Lighthouse, fastest site ever I've ever worked on. Then all those additional layers are added to it. Sometimes unneeded layers are added to it.
Mhm.
And suddenly you're down in the 30s again, right? So just really trying to forecast all of the additional bells and whistles, which may be added to a chat, right? The little
Yeah, that's a
chat
big one.
window that no one uses.
Mhm.
Most interesting question sometimes I ask my clients is like, hey, does this little chat icon actually result in sales at the end of the day? And like, no one can really answer that, right? They're like, yeah, people use it sometimes, this and that. And I like testing that out to see
Yeah.
what the use is. Really cool. So, any expectations when doing a migration in terms of traffic loss? And if there is any traffic or ranking loss, how long do you typically see there being a recovery in Google?
Yeah, so for traffic loss, what I expect to see every migration is about at least 10%. And I consider that a perfect migration. Like everything's good. All the redirects happen. There were no JavaScript issues, no rendering. Like everything is perfect. We still see like a 10% traffic loss. When it's something like that, we see a recovery in about, let's say, 2 months average. Sometimes it's a little bit sooner, but that seems to be when we've watched it about the time. And it comes back and everything's great. So you have to be prepared at least for that. So we call that like, hey, everything's perfect and it'll come back. Don't worry about it. Then when you start to see some issues where not everything gets fixed, that, it's called out, I'd say it goes up to like, you're at the 10 to, well, that's low, like 15 to 20% traffic loss. Like that's not good, but there's issues that we've said like, hey, we give like 4 months because we got to fix those issues. And we know that development is probably, their developers are working on other things, right? They have other priorities. So that's what we've typically seen. And a lot of that, again, does come down to the fact that we're working on somebody else's timetable, right? And so 4 months seems to be the average. Some of the worst cases, though, that I've seen are where I've seen up to like 40%. I think once in a while we've seen 50. And I mean, there's horror stories out there you can see where way more. And in that case, what's happened, nearly every time I've seen it happen, it has been there's been a catastrophe, right? Rendering wasn't handled. It was called out. Developers didn't do it, or there was no time, and C-suite was like, well, we got to launch. No redirects. Like so you've probably seen that, right? They just didn't redirect it. Like,
Yeah.
hey,
I've seen 100%. I've seen 100% loss because of that dastardly robots no index tag left in the code when someone pushes live, right?
Yeah.
So you get that email. Oh, what happened? What's going on with our SEO?
Yep.
Did we not pay you?
It's like, and on that we've seen that actually happen where a JavaScript was adding in a no index tag. It called it out, told the developers like 5 times, and I think it took them like a month to fix it. But, we had said, and thankfully with that, it was on like some weird pages, so it didn't affect everything. But still, that hurts. So, look, it can take some time. And at the end of the day, I think what really matters is how quick you can respond to it. If you can respond quickly, that time is likely going to go down. But if you've done, like, we changed out all of our content and it's completely new, like, unless you change things like back to how they were, it just might not recover. I have seen some stuff where it's permanent, like almost 50% loss, pretty much feels like. Just some sites I know went through something I watch and it's like they never fixed it. It's been a year, problem's still there. Like it's not gonna come back magically.
I think another tip too is that like there's always a countdown to launch day, and then once that gets launched, everyone then like takes off because they've been working so hard.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't do that, right? So you have to have like launch day, but then try to keep like the developers on hand and like a certain percentage of their time around for about a week or two, right? Because there's going to be certain changes that you notice post launch
Yep.
that are really difficult to identify beforehand, right?
Mhm.
So if everyone's like going up and like, oh, we're going to launch this thing on like October 15th, and then like October 16th, they're like, see, I took the day off. I've been working so hard preparing for this
Yes.
migration. Like, what? Like, what? How do I get this changed? How do I fix this? So that's a good tip from my experience working on these as well. One question that comes up quite a bit is, hey, I've migrated from one domain to another domain, right? And you know what? I haven't really lost that much traffic. But when I search Google for a site-specific search for my old URL, site:/old URL, I get all of these results. What's happening there? How come the old domain is still indexed in Google?
Yeah, so I got two answers for that one. One, if you're doing a brand change, I've seen brands stay in even ranking, not even just the site index, for over a year. And that's because in my mind, well, the customer's looking for the old brand. Google knows that the transition happened because other URLs have swapped over, but they want to meet that that query, right? They want that user to get what they want. So the user's shown the old URL, and they jump in. Very common with brand URLs from what I've seen. So on that case, you can't really change anything, but that does explain why, and it's actually a benefit for the user. But with the site index, you have to keep in mind that when you run a search with a site index, that doesn't mean that everything you see there is actually surfaced as a ranking. Like that old URL may show up there, but if you search for like different terms, it doesn't mean it's going to pop up. It's an issue I actually, like I said, it's a question that comes up a lot. I do see it in different areas. Like, hey, like I did this, like this old URL, I thought I removed it, but it's still in the site search. Why is that? It's like, well, it's not actually getting traffic. Like Google grabs everything, right? You'll see stuff that's ancient. That's why the results are always like, it's a million results for like a big site, but there's way more URLs than that. You can't fully trust it. So I view that as like, hey, it's like Google's master list, right? It's everything it's seen. They have it. They can surface it if they want, but it doesn't mean that they will surface it. So you really have to keep that in mind, because if you do that, I mean, you'll go years and you'll run. It's like, it's still there. It's like, yeah, it's still going to be there. I mean, I've seen
search
stuff
for that. It's going to show up, right?
Yeah, like you're going to find it. Google's going to give it to you, but it doesn't mean that a user who, looks up like brand term necessarily is going to get that, or your general term. That doesn't mean it's actually going to surface.
Besides like things like no index lingering around, or maybe some like content you weren't aware of, or lack of redirects, what are some other like commonly overlooked parts of a migration or mistakes that you typically see pop up after the fact that people can identify early on and maybe save some of that traffic going through this process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, canonicals breaking is probably one of the bigger ones. Like I said, sometimes it's an old staging URL. I don't see that one too often, but it does come up. Sometimes you'll see, relative canonicals rather than absolute. Stuff like that you should catch in staging, but sometimes it happens. One thing I do see though, and it's a pain, is scripts that are not live on the staging environment. Like you talked about, those bells and whistles. They're not live on staging, but they go live after the site is moved to production. And then you'll see something like a script closing the head early, and then the canonical tags out there floating in the wind and nothing's going on.
Right.
Google's not grabbing it. We see that usually. Like some of the other things, trying to think here, that I see that are happening. Sometimes internal links never got updated to the new links. On occasion, some old staging links are floating as internal links. So you got to look at that. It's a pain. But otherwise, I mean, I do see like random things pop up, right? It's weird. Like you'll see, like we have a cookie consent form that came up and just somehow like broke things and causes a loop if you access a URL. Like weird things like that happen. But I always look for, beyond, like I said, robots and no indexes and stuff like that. It's usually stuff around maybe a broken redirect, canonical tag issues. And then the other big one is usually, as much as I call it out, images don't always get solved once the site is moved over. And so you've got to, hey, on a speed perspective, you got to fix that. And then the other thing too does come up. a lot of people forget about their images when they do migrations. Either they, if you have image traffic, it's more important to you, so you got to keep that in mind. But sometimes they don't redirect the images. If you're on a CDN, it doesn't matter as much. But if that's something that's important to you, it's something that you should be thinking about. Did I transfer those? Did I redirect those? Did I keep them? Sometimes you'll find old blog articles where something didn't get updated and all the images are broken. Not too common, but if you're an image heavy site, then you want to pay special attention to that.
One thing I've definitely seen slow down domain to new domain migrations is when images and then other assets in the code are still referencing the storage location on the old domain, right? So maybe like instead of old, like, hey, this is our CMS, but here's our FTP, or here's whatever we're hosting over here. So like maybe it's a script, maybe it's a CSS reference, maybe it's an image file, whatever. And I've seen that slowing down so many times. Like it's almost like it's like a mixed signal. It's like when you no index a WordPress page in Yoast, but it doesn't update the sitemap, so it's still in the XML sitemap, right? So like you're telling Google, hey, don't index it. Hey, index it because it's in the sitemap. Don't index it. Index it. So then you get that error, right, within Search Console. You're like, what happened? How come it didn't automatically be taken out of the sitemap? So it's like sometimes that connection of the dots doesn't always happen, and it's worth going through. But it really sounds to me, at the end of the day, the more you can crawl, the more you can get closer to what the site is going to look like in a live environment. And the more you can run more tools that are simply on your, like, the more you can get. I mean, we're all talking about lab data at the end of the day, right? It isn't until you go live you're really going to get that field data. So, but the more you can do that, the more you can mitigate risk when it comes to making that migration. And just continuously, one thing I've also found is that a developer may fix X, but then like even in a new site build, it could be a little bit of whack-a-mole. Like maybe they fixed this, but then they rolled something else back as part of that fix, and something that they addressed a while back is reoccurring again. So just the ability to constantly crawl. Before we kind of get into the end of the show, is there anything else that you feel like on a site migration people should really look into, or any golden tips or nuggets of information you can drop for listeners and viewers today?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things, the great thing is it doesn't just stick with migrations, right? When you're doing that migration, you're going to probably find a lot of technical issues. And what we often find, say 9 times out of 10, there's not enough time to fix all of them. So what we like to do, what I like to do is, here's all my issues. I prioritize them, high, medium, low. And you go in with the expectation that not all of this is going to be fixed. And if you're at an agency or like a tool like side like I am, you don't have exact access to developers, but your client does. Or if you're in-house, then you do. And you really have to keep in mind, like, those developers are working on the migration in ways that you're not. Like server configuration, I don't touch it. Changing all the code, doing all these things in the back end. We as SEOs typically aren't doing that, but developers are, engineers, they're all handling that. So what I would say to make sure everything goes well on the migration side, prioritize your issues in terms of what can go wrong. And if it goes wrong, how bad is it? Is this a high impact? Is this some like JavaScript rendering? There's no rendering active. We have to rely on Google to get it right. And while they do a good job now, that doesn't mean it's a great job. So that's an issue that you got to prioritize. As opposed to like my meta descriptions are 320 characters. Like, I don't care about that at this point. So build a good, strong relationship with developers, and then know that they have other things that they're working on. And those issues that you find, provide them to the developers and tell them, look, here's 10 issues. I need these 4 fixed before we launch. I know you guys have stuff that you're dealing with, want to be respectful of your time. If we don't fix these, here's what's going to happen. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones doing the heavy lifting, right? So you got to be aware of what's going on with them. If you build that good relationship, for one, your critical issues are going to get solved and you're not going to launch with them. You're going to be as close to perfection as you can be on launch day. 2, you build a good relationship. So in the future, when you come to them with like, hey, can we make these changes? They're more willing to make those changes. Because I would say for me, like, if I'm going to break down migrations, like 50% of it is finding issues. Technical side, it's like, hey, we've got JavaScript issues, we've got page speed issues, we've got broken canonical tags, we've got content issues that are happening. But the other 50% of that is knowing that you have a team that's got to fix those and you got to work well with them. So I do think it's one of the areas that I see a lot of struggle in. And if when I work, I try to bridge the gap. I'll talk with developers, at any time. And that comes from just in-house experience of not getting along with developers. So making it a point to, have a friendship, so to speak, a good partnership. That's something to keep in mind. With migrations, at the end of the day, look, you've got issues, we've got technical problems, there's things that are happening, but there's a human element with other people that you really got to think about. And that can be the difference between the critical issue being solved and your migration going well, or you launching and finding out that, hey, all the stuff I reported never got fixed, and now I've got to scramble. So I would say that,
that's a good point on two ends. One, if you're doing an SEO audit as well, you always want to prioritize, right? What can be fixed now? What's the most important thing to be fixed with the upcoming development releases, and what's going to move the needle, right? So from a migration, to be the ability to prioritize and say, okay, maybe these other things we can do after the migration, right? Or maybe I can log in and do some of this, or maybe somebody else can, but you all focus on this because this is the most important thing. And if it's not done, it's not going to look well for any of the teams involved, right? So really, really good tips. Cody, where can we find you online?
Yeah, so actually one of the things I was going to do before I did this, and I didn't get to it, was I'll put a site on my LinkedIn. I own my name. So the .org, there's a .com story there that's very sad. But for right now, I'm just on LinkedIn. I don't really do any social media that much, but you can ask questions there. I've gotten questions, I'll answer them. And then later on, I'll put a site up on there so that people can see where I'm at if they have questions. But yeah, feel free to send something there. I'll answer it. And throw it. If you got interesting questions, I'm happy to hear them. And if I don't know it, then hey, it gives me something to learn,
That's true. That's true. Well, thanks so much for jumping on today. Really appreciate it, especially on this Friday afternoon. You're on the East Coast, right?
I'm on the West Coast, actually. I used to be in New York.
Where are you?
I'm in Oregon. So I'm over here on the West Coast, where you don't go to the beach, you go to the coast.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's just a bunch of rocks.
It's rocks and it's cold. Nobody goes to the
Where
water.
in Oregon are you?
I'm in around the Portland area. So just in that whole metro. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Probably very pretty up there this time of year.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I can look outside. Everything's green. It's very nice. I'm like an hour and a half from the beach. So yeah, that's right. It's wonderful when it's not all on fire.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much for jumping on today. I mean, really, it was great to be able to address a lot of these questions that came up on the last webinar that we had with Conductor, with yourself and Conductor on site migrations, and just really appreciate you jumping on today to talk a little bit more about site migrations and clearing up a lot of these questions. It's really good. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Ahrefs and Adzuma, for making today's show possible. And thank you to Conductor for letting Cody jump on and talk a little bit more about his role inside of the company working on migrations. And it sounds like you're doing quite a lot of them. If this is what you're focusing on, what percent of the time are you focusing on site migrations right now?
I'd say like 75 to 80% of my time is site migrations, with the other 20% just being kind of support for the other members here of technical questions that come up. We've got, sometimes it gets a little lower on the migrations, sometimes it gets a little bit higher, but it's like 80% migrations. I've done a lot.
Amazing. So any of you that have questions about migrations, go to LinkedIn, look up Cody Gault, and you'll find him, ask questions. He's always here. And my understanding is like you were even helping some of the viewers from the old webinar with a little bit of their migration questions after the fact. So it's always great to find someone that's carved out their own little slice of the industry and become a specialist. And you are a site migration specialist. And I'll tell you, Cody, like we said, there's so many companies right now that are changing platforms, changing URLs, changing brands, mergers and acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds like you're going to be a busy bee.
Yep.
All right. All right. Well, thanks again, Cody. Thank you all of you that tuned in today. And thanks a lot to our sponsors again. This has been a great episode of the Search Engine Journal Show. And everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Search Engine Journal Show. If you liked this episode, subscribe to our channel for so much more and click the notification bell so you don't miss a thing.